Before we begin tonight, a quick and heartfelt thank you goes out to David Finnegan for suggesting this episode. David, this one is for you. The Roanoke story has haunted people for centuries, and you had the instinct to know it was exactly the kind of mystery that deserves a long, slow, careful look in the quiet of the night. Thank you for being part of this community. Now, let us begin. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a coastline. Not the coastline you know today, paved over and lit up and mapped down to the last grain of sand. Imagine it wild. Imagine it in the year 1587. The Atlantic pressing into the outer banks of what will one day be called North Carolina. The wind coming in off open water. The smell of pine and salt and wet earth. The calls of birds you would not recognise by name. Somewhere in that landscape, on a slender island called Roanoke, there was a settlement. 115 people, men and women and children. A governor who loved them. A plan that was already fraying at its edges before it had even begun. They carved a word into a wooden post before they left. Croatone. And then they were gone. For more than 400 years that word has been called a mystery, a riddle without an answer, the opening of a ghost story, the seed of a legend. But what if it was never a mystery at all? What if the answer was right there, cut into that wood with a blade, left as plainly as any message could be left? What if the true story of Roanoke is not the story of a colony that vanished, but the story of a truth that was inconvenient, quietly buried and replaced with a better myth? Tonight, we're going to walk that coastline together. We're going to follow those 115 people, not into oblivion, but into a more complicated, more human, more remarkable place. We're going to find the lost colony, because it was never truly lost. It was renamed, and then, slowly, it was written out of the story. Part 1. The Land Before the Legend. To understand what happened at Roanoke, you have to understand what Roanoke was, and more importantly, what it was not. Roanoke Island sits within the Outer Banks, a long chain of barrier islands off the coast of what is now North Carolina. In the late 16th century, this landscape was not empty. It had never been empty. The people living along these shores and in the interior woodlands had been there for thousands of years. They had complex societies, trade networks, agricultural knowledge, and diplomatic relationships with neighbouring groups. The Algonquian-speaking peoples of this region, including the Croatoan on their island to the south, and the Socotan and other groups to the north and west, were not strangers to the idea of outsiders arriving on their shores. But the English who came in the 1580s were something different. They came with paper and ink, and the strange idea that they could own this place simply by writing its name on a document back in London. England in the late 16th century was a nation in the middle of a great anxious ambition. Queen Elizabeth I sat on the throne, and her advisors and wealthy courtiers dreamed of empire. Spain had already built vast wealth in the Americas, hauling silver and gold out of the ground with enslaved labour on a scale that boggled the European imagination. England wanted its share. Sir Walter Raleigh was one of the men given the task of making that dream real. He was charismatic, well-connected, a favourite of the Queen, and he had the rights to explore and colonise a stretch of the American coast that he and his investors called Virginia in honour of the Virgin Queen herself. Raleigh himself never actually went to Roanoke. He sent others. The first expedition in 1584 was a scouting mission, led by Philip Amadus and Arthur Barlow. They returned to England with enthusiastic reports, and importantly, they brought 2 Algonquian men with them. One was named Wanchese, the other was named Manteo. Those 2 names will matter greatly as this story unfolds. The reports Amadus and Barlow brought back painted the land as a kind of paradise. Fertile soil, abundant game, friendly and welcoming people. It was exactly the kind of report that investors and adventurers wanted to hear, and it was exactly the kind of report that omitted the harder truths. The reality, as the English would soon discover, was considerably more complicated. Part 2. The First Roanoke Colony and Why It Failed. In 1585, Raleigh sent the first proper Roanoke colony, It was led by Sir Richard Grenville and consisted largely of military men. This was not a colony of farmers and families looking for a new life. It was an armed outpost, a beachhead, meant to establish a claim and begin building a presence before the real settlers arrived. From the start, things went badly. The relationship between the English colonists and the native peoples of the region deteriorated with remarkable speed. The English were dependent on the local communities for food, a dependency that they resented and that the native people quickly recognised as a point of leverage. When a silver cup went missing from the English camp, Grenville responded by burning a native village and its cornfields. It was a decision that would poison the well for everyone who came after him. The colonists left in charge of the outpost, about 107 men under the command of Ralph Lane, found themselves in an increasingly desperate situation over the following months. They were hungry, they were surrounded by people who had very good reasons to distrust them, and they were waiting for resupply ships that kept not arriving. Lane himself was not a man of particularly good judgment. He received word, possibly accurate and possibly manipulated, that a native leader named Pemisapin was planning an attack on the English. Lane responded by launching a preemptive strike that killed Pemisapin and several of his men. If there had been any chance of a stable alliance, it evaporated in that moment. By the spring of 1586, the surviving colonists were in a desperate state. When Sir Francis Drake arrived with his fleet after raiding Spanish holdings in the Caribbean, the decision was made quickly. Most of the colonists abandoned Roanoke and sailed home to England with Drake. Grenville arrived shortly after with more supplies, found the settlement nearly empty, and left a small group of 15 men to hold the claim. Those 15 men were never seen again. This is the foundation of the Roanoke story that the popular history tends to skip past, because it complicates the romantic narrative. The famous lost colony of 1587 was not the first group of people to disappear near Roanoke, it was the second. The first colony had already demonstrated something important. England's hold on this land was tenuous, fragile, and dependent on factors that the English barely understood and consistently mismanaged. The physical land of Roanoke Island was not particularly hospitable. It was a barrier island, prone to storms, with limited agricultural potential. The real resources of the region lay in the interior and in the knowledge and labour of the native communities who had been working this land for generations. But England needed a colony, and so a second attempt was made. Part 3. John White and the Colony of Families. The second Roanoke colony was conceived differently from the first. Where the 1585 expedition had been a military outpost, the 1587 colony was meant to be a true settlement, a place where English families could put down roots, build communities, and begin the long work of establishing England's presence in the Americas. The governor appointed to lead this enterprise was a man named John White. White was an artist as much as an administrator. He had been on previous expeditions to the region and had produced detailed, careful watercolour paintings of the native peoples and landscapes he observed. Those paintings survive today and are among the most valuable historical records of Algonquian culture in the period before sustained European contact changed everything. White was, by all accounts, a gentle and conscientious man. He cared about the people under his charge. He was also, unfortunately, not a particularly powerful political figure, and the decisions about where the colony would settle and how it would be supported were largely out of his hands. The plan, according to later accounts, was for the colony to settle not on Roanoke Island, but somewhere along the Chesapeake Bay, further to the north. The Chesapeake offered better harbours, richer soil, and a somewhat more defensible position. It was a more sensible destination in almost every way. But when the colonists arrived in July of 1587, the ship's captain, a man named Simon Fernandez, refused to take them further. His reasons have never been entirely clear. Some historians believe he was simply eager to get on with his privateering activities and did not want to spend additional weeks ferrying colonists to a more distant location. Whatever his reasoning, the colonists were put ashore on Roanoke Island. They were back where the first colony had failed. They were on an island that had already proved difficult to supply and dangerous to inhabit. And now they were there not as soldiers who could retreat, but as families who had staked everything on this new beginning. Among the colonists who stepped ashore on Roanoke Island in July of 1587 was John White's daughter Eleanor Dare. She was pregnant. Her husband, Ananias Dare, was with her. On August 18th, 1587, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter. The child was named Virginia Dare, and she became the first child of English parents born in what would become the United States of America. Her birth was celebrated. Her name has echoed through 4 centuries of American memory. But Virginia Dare was born into a colony that was already struggling. The men White sent to check on the 15 soldiers left by Grenville the previous year found only bones. Whatever had happened to those men, it was not good. And on July 28th, colonist George Howe was found dead, killed while crabbing alone near the settlement. The message from the land and from the people on it was not ambiguous. This was not a welcoming place for the English. Part 4. The Island of Croatoan. Before we go further, let us spend some time with the word itself, Croatoan. The name refers to a place and a people. The Croatoan were an Algonquian-speaking group who lived on the island that is now known as Hatteras Island, located south of Roanoke along the Outer Banks. They were not the same people as the Secatan and other groups to the north and west, with whom the English had such disastrous relations. The Croatoan had a somewhat different relationship with the English, mediated in significant part by Manteo. Manteo, you will recall, was one of the 2 Algonquian men who had sailed to England with the scouting expedition of 1584. He had seen London. He had met the Queen's courtiers. He had learned English and served as interpreter and cultural intermediary. By the time of the 1587 colony, Manteo was a figure who stood between 2 worlds. In a ceremony that must have been strange from almost any angle, John White baptised Manteo into the Church of England and named him Lord of Roanoke. It was an English gesture, layering English concepts of title and ceremony onto a man who lived in a world where those concepts meant very little. But it speaks to something real. Manteo was trusted. He was an ally. He was a bridge. And the Croatoan were, through Manteo, the one native group with whom the English had something resembling a working relationship. When things fell apart on Roanoke Island, the most logical direction to go was south, to Manteo's people, to the Croatoan. This is not speculation. This is what the colonists themselves would have known. They had seen the Croatoans' island. They had Manteo. They had a relationship, however complicated and unequal, with that community. And so when John White returned to Roanoke in 1590 to find the settlement abandoned, the word carved into the post was not a riddle. It was an answer. Croatoan. We went south. We went to Manteo's people. Come find us there. Part 5. John White returns to an empty island, August 18th, 1590. John White has been gone for 3 years. He left Roanoke in late August of 1587, sailing back to England to arrange for the resupply that the colony so desperately needed. He expected to return within months. It did not work out that way. The timing of White's departure was catastrophically bad. England was on the brink of war with Spain. The following year, in 1588, the Spanish Armada came for the English coast, and every ship and every resource in England was turned toward defence. Queen Elizabeth personally issued an order that all ships were needed for the war effort. No relief ship could sail for Roanoke. White tried. He managed to get 2 small ships to leave in April of 1588, but they were attacked by Spanish vessels and turned back. He tried again the following year. He tried the year after that. Each time the politics and the logistics and the sheer bad luck of the age combined to keep him from returning. By the time White finally set foot on Roanoke Island in August of 1590, 3 years had passed. Think about what 3 years means. His daughter Eleanor, who had given birth to Virginia Dare just weeks before he left, had been on this island without support for 36 months. His granddaughter Virginia, the first English child born in America, was now 3 years old. What White found when he stepped ashore was haunting in its orderliness. The settlement had not been destroyed. It had been taken apart. The houses were dismantled, not burned. The heavy objects that the colonists could not carry with them, including some of White's own possessions, his maps and paintings and armour, had been buried. There was no sign of battle, no bodies, no evidence of sudden violence. This was not a massacre. This was a departure. The word Croatoan was carved into a post of the palisade. 3 letters, CRO, had been carved into the bark of a nearby tree, as if the fuller message had been started and then continued on the post. White himself recorded that before he left in 1587, he had instructed the colonists to carve a cross if they were in distress, to signal that they had left under duress. No cross was carved. The absence of the cross was, for White, confirmation that the departure had been deliberate and not panicked. He was not mystified by what he found. He understood. But here is where history takes a strange turn. Here is where the story begins to become something different from what it actually was. White attempted to follow up on the carved message. He tried to reach Croatoan Island, but the weather turned. Storms and rough seas made the journey impossible. One of his anchors was lost. The decision was made, not by White, but by the ship's captain, to abandon the search and sail to the Caribbean for the winter before trying again. They never tried again. White never returned to the Americas. He died sometime around 1600, without ever knowing what had happened to his daughter and his granddaughter, and the 112 other people he had left on Roanoke Island. The last mention of Virginia Dare in the historical record is her baptism, recorded by her grandfather with evident pride and love, in the late summer of 1587. She was 9 days old. Part 6. The silence that followed. What happened next is perhaps more telling than what happened before. After White's failed return in 1590, there was no immediate sustained effort to follow up. No English ship sailed south to Croatoan Island to check whether the colonists were there. No investigation was launched. The question of what had happened to the Roanoke colony did not receive the kind of urgent, organised response that you might expect if those in power genuinely wanted the answer. Part of this was practical. England and Spain were still in a dangerous relationship. Raleigh's licence to colonise was complicated by debt and politics. The 1590s were a turbulent decade in English political life, but there is also something worth noting in what the response was not. The carved word Croatoan was not treated, in the immediate aftermath of White's return, as the clear directional clue it actually was. It was noted. And then it was largely set aside. Raleigh did sponsor a few expeditions in the following years, and some of them were instructed to look for signs of the Roanoke colonists. But these expeditions were not specifically tasked with going to Croatoan Island and looking carefully. They were broader reconnaissance missions, and the question of the colonists was one item among many. If you were determined to find 115 people who had gone somewhere and told you where they went, you would go there. You would go directly to Croatoan Island, and you would ask the people there what they knew. It seems that no one did. Or if they did, the results of that inquiry were not preserved in the English record with the kind of detail and urgency that would have existed if the answer had been definitively given. This is where the conspiracy reading of the Roanoke story begins, not with dark rooms and secret orders, but with a quieter question. Why, precisely, did England not look harder for these people? Part 7. The Jamestown Connection. In 1607, 20 years after the Roanoke colonists were left on their island, England established another colony in Virginia. This one would survive. Jamestown, built on a peninsula in the James River in what is now the Commonwealth of Virginia, was not comfortable or easy or prosperous in its early years, but it did not disappear. It became the seed of what would eventually be the United States. Almost from its earliest days, the leaders of Jamestown heard stories about the Roanoke colonists. These stories came through various native intermediaries. They described people who lived among the native communities further to the south, people who had English goods, English skills, English appearance, people who knew how to work copper and iron in ways the local native communities had not known before. Captain John Smith, who would later become famous in the Pocahontas story, recorded some of these accounts. He heard of 4 men, 2 boys, and 1 young woman who had escaped a massacre of some kind, and were living with a chief called Gapanacon. He heard other accounts as well. The Virginia Company, which was funding the Jamestown enterprise, instructed its leaders to look for the Roanoke survivors. There are documents from the early Jamestown period that explicitly mention this task. but the searches that were conducted were limited, and no definitive proof of surviving Roanoke colonists was brought back to England. There are a few ways to interpret this. One interpretation, the mainstream historical one, is that the searches were sincere but came up empty because the colonists had likely died, either from disease or conflict, and any stories of English-appearing people in native communities were either misidentified or simply too vague to follow up on successfully. Another interpretation is more unsettling. The Jamestown colony was itself a fragile thing in those early years. Its leaders were competing with each other, dependent on the Virginia Company's support, and trying to establish a viable English presence in a landscape that was hostile to their ambitions in ways they did not fully understand. The Roanoke story in this context was complicated. If the Roanoke colonists had survived by integrating with native communities, that fact created several problems. First, those survivors, after 20 years, were no longer what the English would recognise as properly English. They spoke native languages, they ate native foods, they lived in native social structures, they may have married into native families. Their children, including Virginia Dare if she had survived, would have been people of two worlds, belonging fully to neither in the eyes of the English. Second, England's colonial enterprise rested on a particular idea, that the English had a right to settle this land, to bring civilization to it, to rule it under the crown. That idea was undergirded by a belief in English superiority, English order, and ultimately English Christianity as the right framework for organising human society. A Roanoke colony that had survived by becoming, in some meaningful sense, Native American, undermined that idea at its roots. The first English colony in America on this telling had not proved English capability. It had proved English dependence. It had proved that the knowledge and the resources and the community structures needed to survive in this land already existed among the people who had been living there for thousands of years. That was a story that did not serve the colonial project, and so, perhaps, it was a story that was allowed to become a mystery rather than a fact. Part 8. What the archaeology suggests. The question of what actually happened to the Roanoke colonists is not merely a matter of historical speculation. It is also an active area of archaeological inquiry, and the evidence that has emerged over the decades is worth considering carefully. The site at Cape Creek on Hatteras Island, in the area that would have been Croatoan territory, has been excavated by a team associated with the First Colony Foundation. What they have found is suggestive, though the interpretation of the finds is contested. Among the items recovered from Cape Creek are objects that appear to be of European origin, a signet ring, a copper farthing of Elizabethan date, pieces of worked copper and iron, and other small objects that would have been unusual in a purely native Algonquian context. Some of these items appear to have been incorporated into native material culture, used in ways that suggest trade or prolonged contact, rather than simple looting of an abandoned site. The signet ring is particularly interesting. It is small and bears a prancing horse design. No one has definitively established who it belonged to, but it is an English object on a Croatoan site from roughly the right period. None of this proves that the Roanoke colonists lived at Cape Creek. What it suggests is that there was sustained contact between English materials and the Croatoan community, contact that went beyond a brief encounter. There is also the matter of genetic studies, some preliminary and some more recent, that have been conducted in coastal communities, particularly among the Lumbee people of North Carolina, who have long maintained an oral tradition connecting their ancestry to the Roanoke colonists. The Lumbee are a recognised Native American tribe with a complicated and sometimes contested history of recognition. Some of their traditional surnames, including Dare, Harvey and others, are names that appear in John White's roster of the Roanoke colony. These genetic and genealogical claims are debated among historians and scientists. The evidence is not clean, the connections are not definitive, but they point in a consistent direction toward a story of integration, of blending, of survival through connection rather than isolation. The colonists who left Roanoke Island in the late 1580s did not walk off the edge of the world. They went somewhere, and the most likely somewhere, given everything we know, is south. to the Croatoan, to Manteo's people, to a community that may have accepted them, integrated them, and allowed them to survive. Part 9. Virginia Dare and the Shape of a Lost Life. If the Roanoke colonists survived among the Croatoan people, then among the survivors was a child. Virginia Dare was born on August 18, 1587, exactly 3 years before her grandfather returned to find the carved word. She was 9 days old when John White left on the ship that would carry him away from her forever. She grew up, if she survived, among the Croatoan. She would have learned to speak their language, or at least to understand it. She would have eaten their food, learned their ways of reading the land and the water and the seasons. She would have grown up knowing that she carried within her a different origin, that she came from people who had crossed a vast ocean and tried to build something new, and that her grandfather had gone back across that ocean and had not come back. The mythology around Virginia Dare is extensive and, frankly, often reveals more about the people who created it than about the historical Virginia. In the 19th century, as American national identity was being constructed, she became a symbol of a particular kind of romantic whiteness, the first English child, the innocent origin of a civilization. Novels were written about her, statues were proposed, she was turned into a fairy tale. The real Virginia Dare, if she survived into adulthood, was probably something quite different. She was probably a person who belonged to two worlds, and perhaps fully to neither. She may have married into the Croatoan community. She may have had children who carried traces of both the English and Algonquian worlds in their blood and their memory. She may have told stories about people who had once lived across the water, and who had tried and mostly failed to understand the land they had come to claim. We do not know. We cannot know. The record does not preserve her. And that absence of record, in a history that was perfectly capable of preserving the records it wanted to preserve, is itself a kind of statement. Part 10. The Myth-Making Machine. The transformation of Roanoke from a complicated historical episode into a Gothic mystery did not happen overnight. It happened slowly, through a process of selective remembering, strategic omission, and the gradual overlaying of later meanings onto older events. By the early 17th century, England and then Britain were building an empire. The colonial project required a certain kind of story about what the English were doing in the Americas. It required a story of destiny, of civilization brought to a wild land, of a people strong enough and capable enough to tame a continent. The story of a colony that had survived by becoming partially native, by intermarrying and adapting and losing its distinctively English character, did not fit that narrative. The story of a colony that had mysteriously vanished, on the other hand, was useful in a different way. It was tragic and romantic. It invited sympathy rather than awkward questions. It made the colonists into victims rather than participants in a complex cross-cultural negotiation. And so, gradually, the mystery version of the Roanoke story became dominant. The carved word Croatoan, which referred to a known place and a known people, became associated with the supernatural and the inexplicable. The absence of bodies and the orderly dismantling of the settlement, which clearly indicated a planned departure, became framed as eerie and uncanny. By the 19th century, the lost colony was a fixture of American Gothic imagination. By the 20th century, it was the subject of novels, plays, television specials, and eventually a genuinely good outdoor theatrical production that has run in North Carolina for decades. The myth had, by then, entirely displaced the reality, or what is more likely the reality. Because the reality, while less dramatic in one sense, is far more interesting in another. The reality is that the Roanoke colonists were human beings, not ghosts. They made decisions. They walked somewhere. They found people who were willing to share space with them. They adapted. They survived. Or they did not. But they did not vanish into thin air. And the word they left behind was not a riddle. It was an address. Part 11. The slow burial of an inconvenient truth. Let us be careful about something here. The conspiracy version of the Roanoke story does not require us to believe in a secret government decree, a room full of men deciding to lie, or a document that was burned so that no one would find it. History is rarely that dramatic, and it is rarely that organised. What the more nuanced version of this story argues is something subtler and therefore more plausible. It argues that the truth about Roanoke was buried not by a specific act of deception, but by the accumulated weight of incentives, each individually small, that pointed away from one kind of story and toward another. The Virginia Company had every incentive to downplay evidence that Roanoke survivors had become assimilated into native communities. Such evidence would have complicated their legal claims to the land, raised awkward questions about the nature of English civilization, and potentially given ammunition to critics of the colonial project. Individual English officials and explorers had incentives to present their findings in ways that made them look capable rather than confused. Finding definitive survivors of the Roanoke colony would have required acknowledging that those survivors had gone somewhat native, which was not the kind of report that played well back in London. The writers and pamphleteers who shaped early American public narrative had incentives to tell a story that glorified English destiny rather than one that complicated it. The Lost Colony was a story about English sacrifice in the face of an indifferent wilderness. The Integrated Colony was a story about English adaptability in the face of a land that already had its own sophisticated civilization. The first story serves the colonial myth. The second story undermines it. And so, over generations, through countless small choices about what to emphasize and what to leave out, through the slow accretion of a myth that served the needs of the people telling it, the more complicated truth receded. It did not vanish. Nothing truly vanishes. The clues remained, carved in wood and buried in archaeological layers and woven into the oral traditions of the people who actually knew what had happened. But they receded from the centre of the story, and the mystery took their place. Part 12, The Map and the Margin. There is one more piece of this story that deserves careful attention. In the archives of the British Museum, there is a copy of a map made by John White during his time at Roanoke. It is a detailed and careful piece of work, showing the coastline, the islands, and the interior in considerable detail for the period. In the early 2000s, a researcher working with the First Colony Foundation noticed something unusual about this map. Beneath a patch, which appears to be a small piece of paper applied to the surface of the map over an original marking, there appears to be a symbol, a star-shaped mark, slightly different from the other symbols on the map. This mark is located at a place on the mainland to the west and southwest of Roanoke Island. If the mark is what it appears to be, and debate among historians continues about exactly what it represents, it suggests that someone, possibly White himself, knew of or planned for a possible location to the west, not just to the south, as an alternative settlement site. It does not prove anything definitive, but it adds a layer to the story. It suggests that the colonists may have been thinking about multiple possible destinations when they prepared to leave Roanoke. They may have had a primary destination, Croatoan to the south, and a secondary option, somewhere to the west on the mainland. What is particularly interesting about this possibility is not the specific geographic detail, but what it tells us about the colonists' state of mind. They were planners. They were not fleeing in panic. They were making organised decisions about where to go, leaving messages, hiding valuables, dismantling structures that they did not want to fall into disrepair or use by people they did not trust. These were people solving a problem. The problem was survival, and they approached it with the limited but real resources available to them. A knowledge of the land's geography, a relationship with the Croatoan, and the carvable surface of a wooden post. If there is something haunting about Roanoke, it is not the mystery of what happened. It is the human detail of how it happened. People making hard choices in a hard place, leaving behind what they could not carry, and trusting that someone would eventually follow the word they had cut into the wood. Part 13. The Oral Traditions That Survived. Before we meet Manteo properly, we need to spend a moment with a category of evidence that written history has often dismissed too quickly: the oral traditions of the people who were there. The Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, a federally recognized Native American group with deep roots in the Carolinas, has maintained for generations a tradition that connects their ancestry to the Roanoke colonists. This is not a recent claim invented for political or cultural purposes. It is a tradition that appears in records as far back as the 19th century. When outside observers noted that the Lumbee had English surnames, spoke English rather than a native language, and had a distinct sense of themselves as a people of mixed heritage. Some of the surnames recorded among the Lumbee in historical census records are surnames that appear on John White's roster of the 1587 Roanoke colony. Dare is one. Harvey is another. These are not common English surnames of the kind that might turn up anywhere. The Lumbee oral tradition holds that their people descended, at least in part, from the intermarriage of the Roanoke colonists and local native communities. This tradition does not claim that all Lumbee ancestors were English. It claims something more nuanced, that among the many threads of ancestry that make up the Lumbee people, one thread runs back to the English settlers who walked south from Roanoke and found a community that absorbed them. Academic historians have treated this tradition with varying degrees of skepticism. The evidence is not clean. DNA studies have produced ambiguous results, partly because the genetic markers expected of Tudor-era English ancestry are difficult to isolate and test reliably across 400 years of subsequent mixing. Some scholars argue that the Lumbee tradition is a form of cultural mythology, a way of claiming a unique identity in the complex racial landscape of the American South, rather than a literal historical account. But it is worth asking what we expect oral traditions to look like, and whether the standards we apply to them are fair. Written history from the colonial period systematically excluded and minimised the voices and perspectives of native people. The records that survive were made by English officials with their own agendas and blind spots. When the written record and the oral tradition point in the same direction as they do here, that convergence deserves more than scepticism. The Lumbee tradition says, some of the Roanoke colonists came to us. They became part of our community. Their descendants are among our people. The written record says, the colonists left Roanoke headed for Croatoan. English materials of Elizabethan date have been found on Croatoan sites. Jamestown settlers heard accounts of English-style survivors among southern native groups. English surnames appeared in communities in the region with no obvious explanation. These are not contradictory stories. They are the same story, told from different sides of the same historical moment. Part 14. The Languages Lost and the Languages Kept. One of the quietest and most haunting aspects of the Roanoke story is what it implies about language. The Algonquian languages spoken by the peoples of the Carolina Outer Banks were rich and complex, the product of thousands of years of human presence in a specific landscape. Like all languages, they encoded ways of seeing the world, ways of categorizing experience, relationships between concepts that did not exist in English. Manteo and Wanchese, the two men who sailed to England in 1584, would have spent their time in England navigating the strange experience of learning a language from the outside. They were not students in a classroom. They were observers, translators, people who had to build a working model of English in their heads from exposure and immersion and necessity. When Manteo returned to the Carolina coast, he carried both languages inside him. He could think in Algonquian and he could think in English, and the space between those two kinds of thinking was where his particular usefulness to both the English and his own people lived. The children of the Roanoke colonists, if they grew up among the Croatoan, would have undergone the same process in reverse. English was the language of their parents and perhaps of their earliest memories. Algonquian was the language of the world around them, the language of the community they lived in, the language you had to learn if you wanted to understand what people were saying to each other when they thought the English children were not listening. Children are extraordinary language learners. Within a few years, a child raised in an Algonquian-speaking community would have been fluent, thinking and dreaming in both languages, code-switching between them as the context required. By adolescence, they might have been more comfortable in Algonquian than in English. By adulthood, with no English-speaking community around them to reinforce the language, English might have retreated to the private interior, the language of memory and family story rather than daily life. Virginia Dare, if she survived, may have grown up telling English words to her children, the way grandmothers tell old stories, in a language that the children half understood, that pointed toward a world that existed only in memory and legend. The word for ocean, the word for England, the word for grandfather. And then those words too would have faded, not because they were lost, because the people who carried them had found a new language to live inside. Part 15, Manteo, the man between worlds. Of all the figures in the Roanoke story, Manteo may be the most essential and the most overlooked. He is there from the beginning, one of the two men who sailed to England in 1584, who stood in English rooms and spoke to English people, and learned enough of their world to serve as a bridge between it and his own. He came back to his homeland not once but several times as the English expeditions continued, always in the difficult position of a person who was useful to both sides and perhaps fully trusted by neither. In 1587 he was baptized into the Church of England, the first indigenous American to receive that sacrament, and was given the title Lord of Roanoke by John White. The ceremony was doubtless stranger from Manteo's perspective than it appeared to the English. His title meant something in their legal and political framework. Its meaning in the social and political world he actually inhabited was something else entirely. But Manteo's importance to this story is not ceremonial. It is practical. The Croatoan were Manteo's people. When the Roanoke colonists needed a direction to walk in, a community that might accept them, a face they knew and trusted in a landscape full of faces that did not know or trust them, Manteo was the connection to that possibility. We do not know what happened to Manteo after 1587. He disappears from the English record just as the colony does. If the colonists went south to the Croatoan, he may have gone with them, or may have already been there. He may have spent years as the living connection between the two groups, the man who could translate, who could negotiate, who could explain. Or he may have died early, and the colonists who had depended on him may have had to find their own way into the Croatoan community without their most important intermediary. We do not know. What we do know is that without Manteo, the Roanoke story looks quite different. Without the relationship he represented between English people and the Croatoan, the colonists would have had no obvious direction to go, no ally community to approach. The carved word Croatoan owes its existence, in some sense, to a man whose name has barely survived in the history books. Part 16. What really happened. As best we can know. Let us try now to put together the most plausible account of what actually happened to the Roanoke colony. Not the mystery version, not the ghost story version, the human version. Sometime in the months following John White's departure in August of 1587, the colonists made a decision. 3 years is a long time, but the decision to leave Roanoke Island was probably made well before that. The evidence of continued English support was non-existent. The tensions with some native groups were real and dangerous. The island itself was not a good place to build a sustainable life. The colonists would have debated their options. They had limited choices. They could stay and hope for relief that might never come. They could try to build ships and sail home across the Atlantic, an essentially suicidal undertaking. Or they could go to the Croatoan, the one community with which they had something resembling a viable relationship. They chose the Croatoan. They dismantled the settlement, not out of panic but out of practicality. Heavy timber and cut wood were valuable. You did not leave it behind if you could carry it. They buried White's possessions, perhaps hoping he would return to find them, perhaps simply unable to carry everything. They carved Croatoan into the post and CRO into the tree, exactly as agreed, without the distress cross that would have indicated they were leaving against their will. And they walked south, possibly by boat, along the barrier islands and inlets, to Croatoan Island. What happened when they arrived is where the story gets more uncertain. The Croatoan community may have received them with some combination of acceptance and caution. The English were not entirely unknown to them. They had Manteo, they had a history of contact, but 100 and some people is not a trivial addition to any community's population. Resources, space, relationships, all of these would have required negotiation. It is quite possible that the colonists did not all stay together. Some may have moved further west into the mainland. Some may have died in the first winters. Others may have found places within the Croatoan community and eventually married into it. Over the years that followed, the English identity of the original colonists would have faded at different rates in different people. Some may have held on to English language and customs with fierce determination. Others may have adapted more readily. Their children growing up among the Croatoan would have known themselves primarily as Croatoan, with stories of a grandfather or great-grandmother who had come from across the water. This is not a tragic ending. It is a human one. People adapt. Cultures blend. Identities are not fixed things. The Roanoke colonists did not vanish. They became part of something larger than themselves, just as the millions of immigrants who would follow them to these shores over the next 4 centuries would also become part of something larger than themselves. The difference is that the Roanoke colonists did it first, and in a direction that the colonial story was not prepared to honour. Part 17. The word we were left with. We began tonight with a coastline and a word. Croatoan, cut into wood with a blade, left as clearly and deliberately as any human being could leave a message. The people who carved that word were not mystical. They were not supernatural. They were not staging some elaborate disappearance for posterity to puzzle over. They were people with children and fears and empty stomachs and the very ordinary human desire to survive. They carved a word that told their story as plainly as they could. And then they went where the word pointed. The mystery that grew up around that word in the centuries that followed is, in its way, a monument to a particular kind of selective memory. The memory that prefers a ghost story to a complicated truth. The memory that would rather imagine people vanishing into thin air than face the reality that they survived by becoming something England did not want them to become. The true Roanoke story is not about disappearance. It is about persistence. It is about the specific, human, practical intelligence of people who are stranded in an unfamiliar land and who found a way through by connecting with the people who already knew that land. It is a story about what happens when 2 worlds collide and the people in those worlds, instead of only fighting each other, sometimes reach out a hand. That is not a comfortable story for a colonial empire to tell about itself. It suggests that the land was not empty. It suggests that the people already there were not obstacles to be cleared, but communities to be learned from. It suggests that survival in a new world required humility, the willingness to say, "We do not know how to live here, but you do, and we need your help." These are not the things that empire likes to admit. And so the story became a mystery, and the mystery became a legend, and the legend became a ghost story, and the actual human beings, the 115 people who walked south to a community that knew how to live in this land, the child named Virginia who grew up speaking Algonquian, the man named Manteo who bridged 2 worlds for his entire remembered life, they were written out, left in the margins, covered over with a patch, like a mark on a map that someone did not want you to see. Epilogue. Standing at the water's edge. Imagine standing on the shore of Hatteras Island just before dawn. The Atlantic is out to the east, dark and moving. The Sound is to the west, quieter, more sheltered. The sky between them is the specific kind of dark that comes just before the light begins. Somewhere beneath you, under centuries of sand and soil and the accumulated weight of all the forgetting that history does to inconvenient truths, there are objects, small things, a ring, a coin, pieces of metal worked by hands that learned their craft in England and then used that craft in service of a community they had come to live inside. The people who left those objects here are gone now in the ordinary way that all people eventually go, not mysteriously, not supernaturally, but simply because time passes and generations turn, and the living become the ancestors, and the ancestors become the earth. But they were here. They chose to be here. They walked from a frightening island to a more welcoming one, following a connection built by a man named Manteo, who had crossed an ocean and come back and found a way to stand in 2 worlds at once. They survived. Not as England wanted them to survive. Not as English colonists planting a flag and claiming dominion, and writing letters home about how they had tamed the wilderness. They survived as people, as human beings adapting to a place that already had its own deep human history, finding a way to be part of that history, rather than in opposition to it. That is the true legacy of Roanoke, not the mystery, not the carved word turning up in horror films and paranormal documentaries, not Virginia Dare as a symbol of romantic white American origin mythology. The true legacy is the simple, stubbornly human fact that when the English ships did not come back, When the supplies ran out and the colony failed on its own terms, 115 people made a choice. They chose life over legend. They chose connection over isolation. They chose to walk toward the people who knew this land and to ask, in whatever language they could manage, if there was room. The word on the post was not a mystery. It was the answer. And if we'd been willing to hear it, 400 years ago or at any point in the 4 centuries since, we would have understood something important about what it means to survive in a place that is not yet yours, in a world that does not yet know your name. You reach toward the people who are already there. You learn from them. You become, slowly and imperfectly and with great difficulty, part of the story they were already telling before you arrived. The lost colony was never lost. It was only ever hiding in plain sight, in the word carved into the wood, in the direction you were always supposed to look, in the community that was waiting just to the south, just down the shore, just past the place where the island ends and the water begins. Croatoan, a destination, not a mystery, not a ghost, a home. Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to ask for your support. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know, and allows us to keep creating these deep dives into the unexplained. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a massive difference, and if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. If this is your first time here and you're enjoying the content, consider subscribing. It means everything. A huge thank you to Stuart for suggesting tonight's topic. This is one of those stories that gets under your skin, not because of what happened, but because of what should not have been possible. Sometimes the most disturbing encounters are not with lights in the sky. They're with people who should not exist. There are cases in UFO research that defy simple categorization. Some involve physical evidence, others involve mass sightings. But there's a third category, quieter and more personal, that involves something far stranger. Contact after the encounter. Not from investigators, not from journalists, but from individuals who claim to represent authority while providing no evidence of it. Individuals whose presence feels staged, whose words feel scripted, and whose very existence leaves no trace once they're gone. This is the story of a man who called himself Ingrid Cold, a man who appeared after a UFO sighting in rural North Carolina, a man who asked questions he already seemed to know the answers to, a man who spoke with the detachment of someone reading from a script they didn't write, and then, just as suddenly as he arrived, he vanished. No records, no follow-up, no proof he was ever real. Who was Ingrid Cold? And more importantly, what was he? This case sits at a crossroads. It connects the classic Men in Black phenomena of the 1950s with the modern era of UFO disclosure. It involves a credible witness who never sought fame. It includes details that resist rational explanation while avoiding the sensational, and at its centre stands a figure who may not have been a figure at all, but rather something else, something that understood how to wear a human face but hadn't quite mastered what goes on behind it. Chapter 1. The encounter that changed everything. To understand the man who called himself Ingrid Cold, we first have to understand the event that preceded him. We need to understand not just what happened, but what it felt like. Because this story is not about lights in the sky. It's about what happens when those lights decide to come closer. January 2007. Rural North Carolina. The landscape outside Fayetteville is flat and quiet. It's the kind of place where the night sky spreads wide and uninterrupted, where the only lights come from scattered farmhouses and the occasional passing car on distant roads. The air in January carries a particular kind of cold, the damp chill that seeps through clothing and settles into bones. Chris Bledsoe was not someone looking for attention. He was a businessman, a family man, living a relatively ordinary life in the quiet farmland that stretched for miles in every direction. He had no history of UFO interest, no background in conspiracy theories, no reason to fabricate what was about to happen. His life was structured around the normal concerns of a man in his position: business dealings, family obligations, the small daily rhythms that make up a life. He was by all accounts grounded, practical, not the type to see things that weren't there. On a cold evening in mid-January, Bledsoe and several family members decided to go fishing along the Cape Fear River. It was supposed to be a simple outing, a chance to relax, a break from the stresses that had been building in his professional life. The river at that time of year runs dark and cold, reflecting what little light reaches it from the winter sky. They set up their fishing gear as the sun began to set. The temperature was dropping, the kind of evening where you can see your breath, where sound carries differently in the cold air. Everything was normal, routine, the kind of peaceful evening that happens 1,000 times across the country without incident. What happened instead would alter the trajectory of his entire existence. According to Bledsoe's account, the first indication that something was wrong came not from sight, but from feeling. A change in the atmosphere, a pressure that seemed to build without source. The kind of sensation you might get before a thunderstorm, except there were no clouds, no wind, just a sudden, inexplicable tension in the air itself. And then they saw the lights, not distant points, not airplanes, not helicopters or drones or any conventional aircraft. These were large, structured objects moving in ways that defied conventional explanation. They appeared over the tree line, silent at first, massive in scale. The light they emitted was unlike anything from a normal source. It didn't scatter or diffuse the way artificial light does. It seemed almost solid, as though the light itself had substance. They hovered, not like helicopters, which create visible disturbance in the air but with absolute stillness. And then they moved. Not gradually, not with the physics of objects bound by inertia and mass, but instantaneously. One moment stationary, the next moment elsewhere, with no transition between positions. Bledsoe described the experience as overwhelming, not just visually but emotionally. He felt drawn to the objects, compelled, as though something was communicating with him on a level beyond language, beyond conscious thought. It was a feeling of being seen, recognized, acknowledged by something vast and incomprehensible. His son was with him, his father, other family members, they all saw it. This was not a solitary experience that could be dismissed as hallucination or misperception. Multiple witnesses, multiple perspectives, all describing the same impossible thing. The encounter lasted hours. Time seemed to behave strangely. Moments that felt like minutes stretched into longer periods. Other spans of time seemed to compress or disappear entirely. It's a common element in high strangeness cases, this distortion of temporal perception, as though whatever was happening existed partially outside the normal flow of time. At one point, according to Bledsoe's account, the objects came closer, close enough that he could see detail, structure. The light didn't illuminate like a searchlight or spotlight. It simply existed, emanating from surfaces that seemed to shift and reconfigure. He described feeling paralyzed, not physically restrained, but unable to move, as though his body had forgotten how to respond to commands from his mind. And then there was the emotional component, an overwhelming sense of awe mixed with terror, the recognition that he was in the presence of something so far beyond human understanding that the normal categories of experience no longer applied. It was beautiful and horrifying in equal measure. When the encounter finally ended, and the objects departed as suddenly and silently as they had arrived, Bledsoe found himself sitting on the cold ground, disoriented and emotionally shattered. His family members were similarly affected. Some were crying. Others sat in stunned silence. All of them knew they had witnessed something that would change them forever. The drive home was quiet. What do you say after experiencing something like that? How do you process an encounter that defies every framework you've built for understanding reality? Bledsoe couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the lights, felt the presence. The experience had opened. Something in his mind, a door that couldn't be closed. He lay in the darkness of his bedroom, listening to the ordinary sounds of his house, and feeling profoundly displaced from the normal world. He had no framework for what he had witnessed, no explanation that made sense. He knew what he had seen was real with a certainty that bypassed doubt. But that certainty brought no comfort, because if it was real, then everything he thought he understood about the world was incomplete. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: this was real. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he lay awake that night, was that the encounter was not over. It was only beginning. Because 3 days later, someone knocked on his door. Someone who should not have known what happened. Someone who had no reason to be there. Someone who called himself Ingrid Cold. Chapter 2. The Visitor Arrives. 3 days after the sighting, Chris Bledsoe was trying to return to normal life. Trying and failing. He had told a few close friends about the encounter. Their reactions ranged from concern to polite skepticism. Some suggested he see a professional. Others changed the subject quickly, uncomfortable with territory that challenged their worldview. It was an isolating experience, to have witnessed something profound and find no one willing to engage with it seriously. He was in his living room when he heard the knock. It was mid-afternoon, the kind of time when unexpected visitors are unusual. The knock itself was formal. 3 precise raps. Not the casual knock of a friend or neighbour. Something more official. When Bledsoe opened the door, he found a man standing on his porch. The first thing he noticed was the suit. It was dark, nearly black, but with a faint sheen that suggested synthetic material rather than quality wool. The cut was oddly generic, as though ordered from a catalogue that hadn't updated its designs in decades. Not quite contemporary, not quite vintage, just slightly wrong in a way that was hard to articulate. The man himself was unremarkable in appearance. Average height, average build. His face had the kind of generic quality that makes it difficult to recall specific features. Later, when Bledsoe tried to describe him to others, he found himself struggling. Was his hair brown or dark blonde? Were his eyes blue or grey? The details seemed to slip away even as he tried to grasp them. But the expression was unforgettable. Blank. Neutral. Not the way someone looks when they're trying to appear neutral, but genuinely empty of affect. His face was like a default setting. No smile lines, no furrows from concentration or worry. Just smooth, unmarked neutrality. The man introduced himself. "My name is Ingrid Cold," he said. His voice was measured, each word given equal weight and spacing. There was no regional accent, no particular inflection, just words delivered with mechanical precision. "I represent a government agency," he continued. "I would like to ask you some questions about the incident that occurred 3 days ago." He did not specify which agency. He offered no identification, no badge, no credentials of any kind. He simply stood there, waiting for Bledsoe's response with that same blank expression. There was something about his demeanour that suggested authority. Not aggressive authority, the kind that demands compliance, but the subtler kind that comes from bureaucratic power. The kind that doesn't need to justify itself because it operates from a position of assumed legitimacy. Bledsoe hesitated. Every instinct told him something was off. But there was also a part of him that wanted answers. If this man represented the government, perhaps there was an explanation. Perhaps what he had witnessed was part of some classified program. Perhaps there was a rational framework after all. "How did you know about the incident?" Bledsoe asked. Ingrid Cold's expression didn't change. "We monitor unusual aerial phenomena," he said. "May I come inside?" The phrasing was strange, formal to the point of being antiquated, and the way he asked permission felt rehearsed, as though he had been taught that this was the appropriate protocol but didn't understand the social nuance behind it. Bledsoe stepped aside and let him in. Ingrid Cold entered with precise movements. He didn't glance around the room the way a normal visitor would, taking in the space and orienting himself. He simply walked to the nearest chair and sat down. His posture was rigid, perfectly vertical, hands placed symmetrically on his knees. "Please sit," he said to Bledsoe, even though it was Bledsoe's own living room. Bledsoe sat. What followed was one of the strangest interviews Bledsoe had ever experienced. Ingrid Cold began asking questions. The questions themselves were straightforward enough. What time had the encounter occurred? How many objects had he seen? What had he felt during the experience? Had anyone else witnessed it? But the delivery was what made it strange. Each question was asked in the same measured tone. There was no variation in pitch or rhythm, no emphasis on certain words, just a flat mechanical recitation of questions that felt like they were being read from a list. And there was no follow-up. In a normal conversation, when someone asks a question and receives an answer, they respond to that answer. They might ask for clarification. They might express surprise or interest. They might pivot to a related question based on what they've learned. Ingrid Cold did none of this. He asked a question. Bledsoe answered. Cold moved to the next question. There was no sense of an actual conversation taking place. It was more like a form being filled out, data being collected without context or comprehension. Bledsoe found himself increasingly unsettled. The man across from him didn't react to anything he said, didn't nod in understanding, didn't write anything down. He simply listened with that blank expression, as though recording the information through some internal process that required no external notation. At one point, Bledsoe attempted to ask his own questions. "Which agency do you work for exactly?" Ingrid Cold paused for a fraction of a second as though processing the query. "That is not relevant to this interview," he said. "Why are you interested in what I saw?" Another pause. "We gather data on unexplained phenomena." The answers were evasive without being obviously deceptive. They provided just enough information to seem like responses while revealing nothing substantive. And there was something else Bledsoe noticed. Ingrid Cold never blinked. Not once during the entire conversation. His eyes remained fixed, unmoving, locked onto Bledsoe with an intensity that felt more like observation than human attention. The interview lasted roughly 30 minutes. Toward the end, Cold asked a question that made Bledsoe's skin prickle. "Did the objects communicate with you?" Bledsoe hadn't mentioned anything about communication. He had described seeing lights, feeling overwhelmed, but he hadn't talked about the sense of contact, of being acknowledged by something intelligent. "What makes you think they communicated?" Bledsoe asked carefully. "It is a standard question," Cold replied, but the timing of it, the specificity suggested otherwise. When the questions finally ended, Ingrid Cold stood up with the same precise movements he had used to sit down. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said. "Will someone be in touch?" Bledsoe asked. "Is there going to be an investigation?" "That will be determined through appropriate channels," Cold said. He walked to the door, opened it, and stepped outside without looking back. Bledsoe followed him to the porch, wanting to ask more questions, wanting some kind of concrete information about what happened next. But when he reached the door, Ingrid Cold was already gone. Not walking down the driveway, not getting into a car, just gone. The driveway was empty. The street was quiet. It was as though the man had simply ceased to exist the moment he stepped off the porch. Bledsoe stood there in the cold afternoon air, staring at the empty space where a man had been moments before, and felt a creeping dread settle over him. No business card, no contact information, no mention of when or if anyone would return. He went back inside and sat down in the same chair where he had been questioned. The room felt normal again. The ordinary afternoon light filtered through the windows. The familiar sounds of his house resumed their regular patterns, but nothing felt normal anymore. Chapter 3. Something Feels Wrong. It wasn't until after Ingrid Cold left that the full weight of the encounter began to settle on Chris Bledsoe. In the immediate aftermath, he had been too focused on answering questions, too caught up in the moment to fully process what was happening. But now, in the silence of his own living room, the strangeness of it crystallized. He had been visited by a man claiming to represent the government. But which part of the government? What agency? And why had he offered no proof of his identity? Bledsoe had dealt with government officials before. Business permits, tax issues, the routine interactions of running a company, and in every single instance credentials had been presented. Identification had been offered. There was always a paper trail, a business card, some physical evidence that the interaction had occurred. In any legitimate investigation, this is standard protocol. Law enforcement officers show their badges. Federal agents present identification. Even survey takers carry laminated credentials. It's how trust is established. It's how authority is verified. Ingrid Cold had provided nothing. Bledsoe began replaying the conversation in his mind. The more he thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Details that had seemed merely odd in the moment now appeared profoundly wrong. Ingrid Cold's speech had been oddly formal, almost archaic in its construction. He had said things like, "May I come inside?" instead of "Can I come in?" He had used phrases like, "That will be determined through appropriate channels," when a normal person might have just said, "I don't know," or "I'll have to check." It was the kind of language you might find in an old government manual, bureaucratic phrasing from a different era. As though someone had learned how officials were supposed to speak, but was working from outdated source material. He didn't use contractions, didn't say "I'm," or "that's," or "we're." Every word was fully enunciated, every sentence complete and formal. It was technically correct English, but it lacked the natural flow and rhythm of actual human speech, and there had been no small talk, none at all. Normal human interactions, even formal ones, include some element of casual communication, a comment about the weather, an apology for the intrusion, some acknowledgement of the social context. Ingrid Cold had offered nothing. No pleasantries, no moments of casual human interaction. It was as though he had been programmed to ask specific questions and nothing more. Any deviation from that program resulted in those strange pauses, those moments where he seemed to be processing before delivering his next scripted line. His movements, too, had felt rehearsed. Bledsoe remembered how Cold had sat, perfectly rigid, spine straight, hands placed with geometric precision on his knees. He hadn't shifted position once during the entire conversation, hadn't crossed his legs, hadn't adjusted his posture. He had simply maintained that same rigid position as though locked into place, and the eye contact, that unblinking stare. In normal conversation, people's eyes move. They glance away briefly. They blink. They show the unconscious movements that come with thinking and processing. Ingrid Cold's eyes had remained fixed, unmoving, locked onto Bledsoe with an intensity that suggested observation rather than engagement. It was like being watched by a camera that happened to be shaped like a person. There was also the matter of his name, Ingrid Cold. Bledsoe repeated it to himself, letting the syllables roll around in his mind. It didn't sound like a real name. It sounded constructed, artificial, like a name someone might use if they needed a name but didn't understand how names actually worked. Ingrid is traditionally a Scandinavian name, most commonly given to women. For a man to have that name was unusual but not impossible. But paired with Cold as a surname, it took on an almost allegorical quality. Cold, emotionless, detached, distant. Was it a real name, or was it a designation? A code that meant something specific within whatever system Ingrid Cold operated from? Bledsoe tried to recall if Cold had shown any personal characteristics at all, any detail that might indicate he was an actual person with an actual life. But there was nothing. No wedding ring, no watch, no pen in his pocket, no phone clipped to his belt, nothing to suggest a life beyond this single interaction. It was as though Ingrid Cold had been assembled specifically for this encounter, and would be disassembled once it was complete. And there was something else. Something Bledsoe couldn't quite articulate but felt deeply in his gut. Ingrid Cold's presence had felt wrong, not threatening in an aggressive way, but fundamentally off. Like watching an actor play a role they didn't fully understand. Someone going through the motions of being human without grasping what being human actually means. The uncanny valley, that's what psychologists call it. The sense of wrongness we feel when something appears almost human but isn't quite right. A mannequin in dim light. a very realistic robot, something that mimics humanity closely enough to trigger our social recognition systems, but not quite perfectly enough to be convincing. Ingrid Cold had existed in that valley, close enough to human to pass at first glance. But upon reflection, upon careful consideration of all the small details, fundamentally wrong. Bledsoe stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the afternoon was peaceful. His neighbours' houses sat quiet in the fading light. Cars passed on the distant road. Everything was normal. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just been interviewed by something that was only pretending to be a person, and that pretense had not been entirely successful. Chapter 4. Knowledge He Shouldn't Have. In the weeks following the visit, Chris Bledsoe tried to return to his normal life. He went to work. He interacted with his family. He attempted to file away the experience as just another strange element of an already strange situation. But he couldn't, because strange things kept happening. Small things at first, synchronicities that could be dismissed as coincidence. He would think about the encounter and the phone would ring. He would decide to research UFO phenomena online, and his internet would disconnect. His electronics began behaving erratically, computers freezing, phones dropping calls, the television switching channels on its own. These could all be explained rationally. Technology malfunctions, random chance, confirmation bias. But the frequency and timing of these events created a pattern that was hard to ignore. And then there were the predictions. During their conversation, Ingrid Cold had made certain statements. At the time, Bledsoe hadn't paid much attention to them. They had seemed like generic observations, vague comments that could apply to almost anyone. But then those statements started coming true. Cold had mentioned that Bledsoe would face professional difficulties in the coming months. At the time, Bledsoe's business was stable. There was no indication of problems, but within weeks, deals began falling through. Clients became unreachable. Financial pressures mounted in ways that seemed to come from nowhere. Cold had mentioned that Bledsoe would have difficulty sleeping. Another generic statement that could apply to almost anyone under stress. But Bledsoe began experiencing severe insomnia. Not the normal kind where you have trouble falling asleep. This was different. He would lie awake for hours, feeling completely alert, as though sleep itself had become impossible. And when he did finally drift off, his dreams were vivid and disturbing. Cold had asked if Bledsoe would be speaking to researchers about his experience. At the time, Bledsoe had no plans to do so, but within a month, he found himself being contacted by UFO investigators who had somehow learned about his encounter. People he had never met, people who claimed to have heard about his experience through channels he couldn't identify. How had they known? He had told only a few close friends. He had not filed any reports. He had not contacted any organizations, and yet researchers were showing up, asking questions, wanting details. It was as though his experience had been logged somewhere, catalogued in some system that certain people had access to, a system that existed outside official channels. But the most disturbing prediction was the most specific. During their conversation, Cold had made an odd comment about Bledsoe's family. He had said, almost casually, "Your son will also have encounters." At the time, Bledsoe hadn't known how to respond to that. It wasn't framed as a question. It was stated as a fact, as though Cold was not predicting the future, but reading from a timeline that had already been written. 6 weeks later, Bledsoe's son reported seeing lights identical to the ones they had witnessed together. But this time, his son was alone. And this time, the encounter was even closer, more intense, more personally directed. How could Ingrid Cold have known that would happen? How could he have predicted specific future events in the lives of people he had never met before? If Cold was simply a government investigator, his knowledge made no sense. There had been no surveillance in place before the first encounter. No reason for any agency to be monitoring the Bledsoe family. They were ordinary citizens living ordinary lives, unless the government had been monitoring them before the encounter, unless they had known something was going to happen, unless the UFO phenomenon itself was connected to some kind of predictive system. that allowed authorities to anticipate sightings before they occurred. That possibility was disturbing enough. But there was another interpretation, one that Bledsoe tried not to think about but couldn't entirely dismiss. What if Ingrid Cold wasn't there to gather information? What if he was there to confirm what he already knew? Not because he had access to surveillance systems or classified databases, but because he was part of the same phenomenon as the lights themselves. What if he hadn't been sent to investigate a UFO encounter? What if he was part of the UFO encounter, an extension of whatever intelligence had appeared in the sky 3 days earlier? That would explain his impossible knowledge. It would explain why he spoke as though reading from a script. It would explain the lack of credentials, the absence of records, the strange behaviour. Because he wasn't a government agent at all. He was something else. Something that understood it needed to appear as a government agent, but didn't quite know how to execute that appearance convincingly. Bledsoe kept these thoughts to himself. He knew how they sounded. Paranoid, conspiratorial, the kind of thinking that gets people dismissed as unstable. But he also couldn't ignore what he had experienced. The encounter was real. Ingrid Cold was real. The predictions that came true were real. And somewhere in that reality was a truth that resisted conventional explanation. This is where the encounter shifts from strange to genuinely unsettling. Because if Ingrid Cold was simply an investigator, his knowledge could potentially be explained. Maybe he had conducted surveillance. Maybe he had interviewed others who were present. Maybe he had access to classified monitoring systems that tracked UFO phenomena. But if he wasn't an investigator, if he was something else entirely, then his knowledge suggests something far more disturbing. That he wasn't there to gather information. He was there to let Bledsoe know he was being watched. To establish that the encounter was not over. To make it clear that whatever had appeared in the sky that night had not simply observed and left. It had marked him, and it would be back. Chapter 5. The Men in Black Parallel. The story of Ingrid Cold does not exist in isolation. It is part of a much larger, much older pattern. A pattern that stretches back to the earliest days of modern UFO research and continues into the present day. A pattern that involves strange visitors who appear after sightings and leave witnesses more confused than enlightened. They are called the Men in Black. The phenomenon has been so thoroughly absorbed into popular culture that the term itself has lost much of its original strangeness. Movies and television shows have turned the Men in Black into government agents, secret organisation members, even aliens disguised as humans. The Hollywood version is slick, professional, equipped with advanced technology. But the original reports, the ones that emerged in the 1950s and 60s, describe something far stranger and more unsettling. Something that fits the Ingrid Cold encounter with disturbing precision. The first widely documented case involved a man named Albert Bender. In 1953, Bender was running a UFO research organisation called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. He was investigating sightings, collecting data, building a network of researchers and witnesses, and then one day 3 men in dark suits showed up at his door. According to Bender's account, these men knew details about his research that should have been private. They spoke in strange, formal language. They made veiled threats about what would happen if he continued his investigations. And then they left, vanishing as mysteriously as they had arrived. Bender was terrified. He shut down his organisation, he stopped researching UFOs entirely, and for years he refused to discuss what had happened. When he finally did write about the encounter, his description of the visitors was deeply unsettling. They weren't quite human, he suggested. They moved strangely. Their voices sounded wrong. Their eyes seemed to look through him rather than at him, and their presence triggered a visceral fear response that went beyond normal intimidation. In the decades that followed, similar reports multiplied. UFO witnesses across the country began describing visits from strange men in dark suits who showed up unannounced in the days or weeks following sightings. The pattern was remarkably consistent. They arrived unannounced, usually within days of a UFO encounter. No phone calls beforehand, no appointments scheduled, they simply appeared. They claimed to represent government agencies but provided no credentials. Sometimes they flashed badges too quickly to examine. Other times they offered nothing at all. They operated from assumed authority without proving that authority existed. They asked questions in a detached, emotionless manner. Witnesses described their speech as robotic, mechanical, as though reciting from a script. The conversations felt rehearsed, artificial, lacking the natural flow of human interaction. They displayed behaviours that seemed slightly out of sync with normal human interaction. Some reports described men in black who didn't seem to understand how doors worked, reaching for handles in awkward ways. Others mentioned visitors who sat too rigidly, moved too precisely, spoke in patterns that felt programmed rather than spontaneous. They wore clothing that seemed slightly out of date, dark suits that looked like they came from an earlier era, hats that hadn't been fashionable in decades, ties and shoes that suggested someone's idea of how authority figures should dress based on outdated information. And then they vanished, leaving no trace of their existence. No one could track them back to any agency. No one could verify their identities. They existed only in the moment of encounter and then dissolved back into whatever void they had emerged from. Some witnesses reported even stranger details. Men in black who seemed confused by ordinary objects, who asked bizarre questions about mundane things, who appeared to be learning about human culture in real time. One famous account from the 1960s involved a woman who offered her men in black visitors a glass of water. According to her report, they stared at the glasses with apparent confusion before attempting to drink. One of them tried to consume the water by holding the glass against his face without opening his mouth, as though he understood the concept of drinking but not the mechanism. These details could be dismissed as embellishment, memory distortion, the tendency of stories to become more elaborate with each retelling, but the consistency across multiple reports, from witnesses who had no contact with each other, is harder to explain, and Ingrid Cold fits this pattern perfectly. He arrived 3 days after a UFO sighting. He claimed government affiliation without providing proof. His demeanour was emotionless and his speech was oddly formal. He asked questions as though following a script. He displayed knowledge he shouldn't have possessed, and then he vanished without a trace. But there's one key difference between Ingrid Cold and the classic Men in Black reports. One detail that makes his case particularly intriguing. Most Men in Black reports involve unnamed individuals. They're described only by appearance and behaviour. No names are given, no identities are claimed. They're anonymous figures who exist only in the role they're playing. But Ingrid Cold introduced himself. He gave a name. Strange as that name might be, it was specific, deliberate. This raises troubling questions. Was Ingrid Cold a real person using a false name? Was the name itself some kind of code or designation? Or was it an attempt by something non-human to create a plausible human identity without fully understanding how human names work? The fact that no records exist for anyone named Ingrid Cold working in any government capacity during that time period suggests the name was fabricated. But why fabricate a name that sounds so obviously wrong? Why not choose something more conventional, more forgettable, unless the wrongness was intentional, unless the name was designed to be remembered, to stick in the mind of the witness and create that sense of unease that makes the encounter unforgettable? In the literature of Men in Black encounters, there's a theory that these visitors are not trying to silence witnesses. If they wanted silence, there are more effective methods. Instead, they seem designed to destabilize, to create confusion and doubt, to make the witness question their own perceptions. By appearing with apparent authority but no proof of authority, they create cognitive dissonance. The witness knows something is wrong but can't quite articulate what. They want to report the encounter, but to whom? The visitors claim to be from the government. How do you report a suspicious government agent to the government? It's a psychological trap, and it's remarkably effective. Chris Bledsoe experienced exactly this. After Ingrid Cold's visit, he attempted to verify the encounter. He called local authorities, he contacted federal agencies, he tried to find any record of an investigation into his sighting, and he found nothing. No one had authorized an interview. No one had sent an investigator. No agency claimed responsibility. The visit had occurred in a bureaucratic void. Officially it never happened, but Bledsoe knew it had happened. He had sat across from Ingrid Cold. He had answered the questions. The encounter was undeniably real. But how do you prove something that leaves no evidence? How do you convince others of an experience that exists only in memory? This is the genius, if we can call it that, of the Men in Black phenomenon. It operates in the space between proof and experience. It's real enough to traumatize the witness, but intangible enough to resist verification. And Ingrid Cold executed this perfectly. Chapter 6. The name itself. Let's spend some time examining the name, because in cases like this, every detail matters. Names are how we identify ourselves, how we establish identity within social structures. They carry cultural weight, family history, personal meaning. Ingrid Cold. Say it out loud. Let the syllables form in your mouth. Notice how they feel, how they sound, the way they combine. There's something fundamentally strange about this name. It doesn't flow naturally. It doesn't have the organic quality that most names possess. It sounds constructed, assembled, like something created by someone who understood that humans have names, but didn't fully grasp the cultural and linguistic patterns that govern how names actually work. Let's start with the first name, Ingrid. Ingrid is a Scandinavian name. It derives from Old Norse and means beautiful or fair. It's traditionally a feminine name, though not exclusively so. It was popular in Scandinavian countries and among Scandinavian immigrant communities in America during the early to mid-20th century. For a man to have the name Ingrid is unusual, not impossible. Names sometimes cross gender boundaries. Parents make unconventional choices. Cultural contexts shift, but it's uncommon enough to be notable. The name also carries a specific cultural and temporal association. It feels like a name from a particular era, the 1930s through the 1950s, the age of Ingrid Bergman and similar cultural figures. It's not a contemporary name, not something you'd expect a government agent in 2007 to possess, unless, of course, that agent was operating from outdated information about human naming conventions, unless whoever or whatever created the identity Ingrid Cold was working from source material that was decades old. Now consider the surname, Cold. Cold is an English surname with Germanic roots. It's uncommon but not unknown. Like many surnames, it likely originated as a descriptive term. Perhaps an ancestor lived in a cold region. Perhaps they had a cold demeanour. Perhaps it was a mistranslation or corruption of another name. But paired with Ingrid, it takes on new meaning. The name becomes allegorical. Ingrid Cold. Cold as in emotionally distant, detached, unfeeling, inhuman. It's almost too perfect. Too on the nose. Like a name chosen to communicate something about the person bearing it. A designation rather than an identity. Some researchers have suggested the name is a code, that Ingrid might refer to a specific program or operation, that Cold might indicate a particular role or function within whatever system deployed this visitor. In intelligence communities, code names are common. Operations are given designations that mean nothing to outsiders, but communicate specific information to those in the know. Could Ingrid Cold be such a designation? A way for one operative to identify themselves to another, not meant to be a convincing human name, but rather a signal that would be recognised by the right audience. Others believe the name is a translation error. This theory suggests that whatever entity Ingrid Cold truly was, it was attempting to translate its actual designation into human language, and arrived at something that was close but not quite right. Like running a phrase through a faulty translation algorithm and getting output that's technically correct, but sounds wrong to a native speaker. In this interpretation, Ingrid Cold might be the closest English approximation of something that exists in a non-human language or conceptual framework. The entity understood it needed a name. It attempted to generate one, but lacking true understanding of how human names function culturally and linguistically, it produced something that was almost right but fundamentally off. Still others think the name is intentionally unsettling, that it was chosen specifically to create discomfort and doubt in the witness. a psychological tactic designed to make the encounter more memorable and more disturbing. If you want someone to remember an interaction, you give them something that doesn't fit, something that creates cognitive dissonance, something their brain will keep returning to because it can't quite process it correctly. A man with a woman's name, a combination that sounds like allegory, a designation that feels like code. These elements stick in memory. They create that uncanny valley effect. They make the witness question not just the visitor, but their own perception of the encounter. What we know for certain is this. There are no records of anyone named Ingrid Cold working for any known government agency during that time period. No employment records, no public listings, no digital footprint, no paper trail, nothing. In the modern era, this kind of complete absence is almost impossible to achieve. We all leave traces: social security numbers, tax records, employment history, credit reports, online presence. Even people who deliberately try to live off the grid leave some kind of documentation. But Ingrid Cold left nothing. Bledsoe tried to find him, tried to verify his existence through every channel he could think of, and came up empty every single time. It was as though the name existed only in that single conversation, spoken once and then dissolved back into whatever void it had emerged from. The name exists only in Chris Bledsoe's account, only in the testimony of a witness describing an encounter that officially never happened with a person who officially never existed. And that absence is, in its own way, more disturbing than his presence ever was. Because if Ingrid Cold was a real person using a false name, there should still be some trace of the real person, some way to track backwards from the encounter to an actual identity. But there's nothing. If the name was a code, someone in the intelligence community should recognize it. Someone should be able to confirm that yes, this is a designation we use, even if they can't reveal what it means. But no one does. If it was a translation error, there should be similar cases, other witnesses, encountering visitors with equally strange names that suggest attempted translation from non-human frameworks. And while there are strange names in Men in Black reports, none quite match this pattern. The mystery of the name remains unsolved. Like everything else about Ingrid Cold, it exists in that space between rational explanation and genuine anomaly. Close enough to normal to almost make sense. Strange enough to resist any comfortable interpretation. Ingrid Cold. A name that sounds like it should be real but isn't. A designation that might mean everything or nothing. An identity that exists only in the moment of its claiming and nowhere else. Say it again. Ingrid Cold. Feel how the syllables don't quite fit together, how the name creates a small discomfort in the mind. That discomfort is intentional, or it's an accident that reveals deeper truth about the nature of the phenomenon. Either way, it's effective. Because decades from now, when other details of this case have faded, that name will remain. Ingrid Cold. The man who might not have been a man at all. The agent without a file. The visitor who existed only long enough to ask his questions, and then disappeared. Chapter 7. The silence that followed. After Ingrid Cold left Chris Bledsoe's home, walking out the door and vanishing into impossible absence, there was no follow-up. No phone calls, no letters, no second visit, no contact of any kind. This itself was strange, because in any legitimate investigation there's always follow-up. Law enforcement comes back with additional questions as new information emerges. Federal agents maintain contact with witnesses. Even insurance adjusters check in to clarify details. Follow-up is standard procedure. It's how investigations work. You conduct an initial interview, gather preliminary information, and then return with more specific questions once you've had time to analyse what you've learned. But Ingrid Cold never returned, and no one else showed up in his place. Bledsoe waited for days, expecting another knock on the door. He kept his phone close, anticipating a call. He checked his mail for official correspondence. Nothing came. The silence was absolute, as though the interview had been a self-contained event with no connection to any larger process. A data collection mission that began and ended in that single 30-minute conversation. After a week of waiting, Bledsoe decided to take action. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong about the encounter. the lack of credentials, the strange behaviour, the impossible knowledge, the name that sounded fake, all of it added up to something that required investigation. So he started making calls. His first attempt was local law enforcement. He called the Fayetteville Police Department and asked if they had sent anyone to interview him about a UFO sighting. The officer who answered the phone was polite but confused. No, they hadn't sent anyone. They don't investigate UFO sightings. That's not within their jurisdiction. Bledsoe tried the county sheriff's office. Same response. No one had been dispatched. They had no record of his incident, and they certainly hadn't sent anyone named Ingrid Cold. He contacted the North Carolina State Police. Again, nothing. No investigation, no record, no agent by that name in their system. Moving up the chain, Bledsoe tried federal agencies, the FBI first. He called their Charlotte field office and explained the situation. A man claiming to represent a government agency had shown up at his home asking questions. The man had provided no identification. Bledsoe wanted to verify if this was legitimate, or if he should be concerned about potential fraud or impersonation. The FBI took his report. They seemed interested, professional. They said someone would look into it and get back to him. No one ever did. He tried the Department of Defense. Surely if there was a program investigating UFO sightings, it would be connected to military intelligence in some way. But navigating the DoD's phone system was like trying to find your way through a maze designed to prevent navigation. He was transferred multiple times, placed on hold for extended periods, eventually disconnected. When he finally reached someone who listened to his story, they told him there was no current program investigating UFO phenomena. That program had ended in the 1960s. If he wanted to file a report, he could contact NASA or the FAA, but the military had no active interest in such cases. Bledsoe tried NASA. They were polite but clear. They study space, not unidentified aerial phenomena. They recommended he contact local law enforcement. Full circle. Back to square one. Every agency passing responsibility to another agency, all of them claiming no knowledge, no involvement, no interest. It was bureaucratic limbo. His encounter existed in a gap between jurisdictions, falling through the cracks of official systems that weren't designed to handle this kind of report. But here's what made it truly unsettling. Ingrid Cold had demonstrated detailed knowledge of Bledsoe's encounter. He had asked specific questions about timing, duration, physical details. He had known things that Bledsoe hadn't shared with anyone outside his immediate family. If no government agency was investigating, how had Cold obtained that information? If there was no active program monitoring UFO phenomena, how had he known about the sighting in the first place? The only logical explanations were disturbing. Either there was a classified program operating outside normal channels, one that denied its own existence even to other government agencies. A black budget operation so compartmentalised that the left hand genuinely didn't know what the right hand was doing. Or Ingrid Cold had never been part of the government at all. He had simply claimed to be, and his knowledge came from some other source entirely, a source that had access to information no human agency could possess. Bledsoe didn't know which explanation was more frightening. He tried one more avenue, Freedom of Information Act requests. If there was any documentation of his case, any official record of an investigation, FOIA requests should surface it. Even if the content was redacted, the existence of files would confirm that something had happened. He filed requests with every agency he could think of: FBI, CIA, DIA, NSA, DOD. Each request asked for any and all documents related to his UFO sighting and any subsequent investigations. The responses trickled in over the following months. The FBI found no records. The CIA found no records. The DIA found no records. Every agency came back with the same answer: negative results. No documentation matched his search parameters. It was as though the entire event had occurred outside official reality. The sighting had happened, the visit had happened, but, according to every official system designed to track and document such events, nothing had happened at all. This is where the case moves from strange to officially unsettling. Because in any legitimate government operation, there is documentation. There are records. There is a chain of command. There are forms to fill out, reports to file, databases to update. Even the most highly classified operations leave paper trails. They exist in systems, even if those systems are compartmentalized and access restricted. When the government interviews someone, that interview generates documentation. An agent files a report. The information is logged. The case is assigned a number. It enters the bureaucratic machinery that processes information. But Ingrid Cold left nothing. No report, no case file, no assignment number, no documentation whatsoever. It's almost impossible for a legitimate government agent to operate that way. The entire system is built on documentation. You can't function within the bureaucracy without generating records, unless you're not part of the bureaucracy, unless you're operating entirely outside it, unless you're something that's only pretending to be part of official systems while actually existing in a completely different framework. Bledsoe was not alone in this experience. When he eventually connected with UFO researchers and shared his story, he learned that other witnesses had reported similar patterns. Visits from alleged government agents that left no trace, interviews that were never documented, follow-up that never materialized. The pattern suggested something deliberate. These visitors, whoever or whatever they were, operated in a way that specifically avoided creating documentation. They appeared, they observed, they asked their questions, and then they vanished, leaving the witness to wonder if the encounter was real at all. This is what some researchers call high strangeness, events that are too structured to be, hallucinations but too anomalous to fit within conventional reality, encounters that have the feel of intelligence and purpose, but resist every attempt at verification or documentation. Bledsoe's attempts to verify Ingrid Cold's visit became part of the case itself. The complete absence of records became evidence. Not evidence that it didn't happen, but evidence that something deliberately designed to avoid documentation had happened. And that absence spoke volumes. It suggested intentionality. It suggested a system operating parallel to official systems. It suggested visitors who understood they needed to appear official, without actually being official, who knew exactly how to navigate the gaps in bureaucratic coverage. Or it suggested something that didn't understand bureaucracy at all, that simply mimicked what it thought official authority looked like, without grasping the underlying structures that make such authority real. Either way, the silence that followed Ingrid Cold's visit was not empty. It was full of negative space, full of absences that outlined a presence, full of missing documentation that testified to something that occurred outside documented reality. The phone call stopped. The FOIA requests dried up. Bledsoe eventually accepted that he would never get official confirmation of what had happened. But he knew. He had sat across from Ingrid Cold. He had heard that mechanical voice. He had felt that uncanny presence. The encounter was real, even if every official system insisted it wasn't. Chapter 8. Expansion of the theory. As word of the Ingrid Cold encounter spread through UFO research communities, it began to take on a life of its own. Researchers connected it to other cases. Witnesses came forward with similar experiences. Patterns emerged that suggested this was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger, more complex phenomenon. The story moved beyond simple Men in Black comparisons. It became a reference point for understanding something deeper about how high strangeness events unfold, about the relationship between the initial encounter and what comes after, about the ways in which contact with the unexplained doesn't end when the lights disappear. One of the most significant frameworks that emerged was the concept of the hitchhiker effect. The term was coined by researchers studying cases where paranormal or anomalous events seemed to follow witnesses long after their initial encounter, as though the experience had opened a door that couldn't be easily closed. The pattern was remarkably consistent across diverse cases. Someone witnesses a UFO. The immediate encounter ends. They return to normal life. And then strange things start happening. Electronic disturbances, devices malfunctioning without explanation, computers behaving erratically, phones receiving calls from numbers that don't exist, sleep disturbances, vivid dreams, night terrors, the sense of being watched while trying to sleep, waking up in positions or locations different from where they went to bed, synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that pile up beyond statistical probability, seeing repeating number patterns, encountering people who mention the exact thing you were just thinking about, experiences that feel orchestrated. And then there were the visitors, not just men in black, though they were certainly part of the pattern, but also other strange figures, people who appeared at odd times, asked bizarre questions, and then disappeared without explanation. In some cases, these visitors claimed to be checking meters or delivering packages, but when the witness looked outside moments later, no vehicle was visible. When they checked with utility companies or delivery services, no one had been dispatched to their address. The hitchhiker effect suggests that UFO encounters are not discrete events. They're not something that happens and then ends. They're more like infections, contaminations. Once you've had contact, you're marked, tagged, and the phenomenon continues to interact with you in ways that are subtle, confusing, and deeply disorienting. Chris Bledsoe's experience fit this pattern perfectly. The UFO encounter on the Cape Fear River was just the beginning. Ingrid Cold's visit was the next phase, and then came everything else. The electronic disturbances. His computers failed at critical moments. His phone would ring and no one would be on the line, or a voice would speak in that same flat mechanical tone he had heard from Ingrid Cold. The sleep disturbances. He would wake at exactly 3 a.m, night after night, feeling completely alert as though something had woken him deliberately. His dreams became populated with strange figures who asked questions and spoke in formal, archaic language. The continued sightings. The lights appeared again, multiple times, sometimes alone, sometimes with family members present, always with that same sense of being acknowledged, recognised, tracked, and there were more visitors, not always claiming to be government agents, but always appearing unexpectedly and behaving strangely. A man who showed up claiming to be conducting a survey, but asked questions that seemed designed to assess Bledsoe's mental state. A woman who appeared at his workplace asking about the events, without specifying which events she meant. Each encounter added to the sense that he was being observed, monitored, that his life had become an ongoing experiment or observation project run by something that existed just outside his ability to perceive it directly. UFO researchers who studied Bledsoe's case began comparing it to other high-strangeness scenarios. The more they looked, the more patterns emerged. There was the case of John Keel, the researcher who coined the term Men in Black, and documented countless similar encounters during his investigations in the 1960s. Keel himself experienced the hitchhiker effect. The more he researched UFOs, the more strange events occurred in his own life. Phone calls with mysterious voices, letters that appeared in his mailbox without postage, visitors who knew things they shouldn't know. Keel eventually came to believe that the UFO phenomenon was not extraterrestrial in the traditional sense. It was something stranger, something that existed alongside human reality, occasionally intersecting with it, manipulating perception, and creating experiences that seemed designed to confuse and destabilize. There was the case of Whitley Strieber, who wrote about his experiences in communion. Strieber described not just alien encounters, but a complete transformation of his reality. Strange visitors, missing time, the sense that his entire life had become permeable to forces he couldn't understand or control. There was the Skinwalker Ranch phenomenon, where researchers documented layer upon layer of high strangeness events. UFO sightings were just the surface. Below that were animal mutilations, poltergeist activity, apparitions, time distortions, and yes, mysterious visitors who appeared on the property without explanation. The common thread through all these cases was that the phenomenon didn't behave like simple extraterrestrial visitation. It behaved like intelligence at play, like something running experiments or tests, like something that wanted to interact with human consciousness in ways that resisted simple categorization. And central to many of these cases were visitors like Ingrid Cold, figures that appeared human but behaved strangely, that claimed authority without providing proof, that demonstrated impossible knowledge and then vanished without trace. Some researchers proposed that these visitors served a specific function. They weren't trying to silence witnesses. If that was the goal, there were more efficient methods. Instead, they seemed designed to destabilize, to create paranoia, to make the witness question their own perceptions. By appearing with authority but no credentials, they created cognitive dissonance. The witness knew something was wrong but couldn't articulate what. They wanted to report the encounter but didn't know to whom. The visitors claimed to represent official systems, so how do you report them to those same systems? It was a psychological trap, and it was remarkably effective. Witnesses became isolated. They stopped talking about their experiences. They withdrew from research communities. They questioned their own memories and perceptions. If the goal was to prevent information from spreading, this method worked better than direct threats or intimidation, because it turned the witness's own mind against them. But here's where the theory gets darker, and more disturbing in its implications. Some researchers suggest that these follow-up encounters are not just monitoring or intimidation. They serve a deeper function. They're part of the experience itself. The UFO sighting is not the event, it's the trigger. The real interaction happens in the days and weeks and months that follow. In this interpretation, beings like Ingrid Cold are not separate from the UFO phenomenon. They are the UFO phenomenon, manifesting in a different form. The lights in the sky get your attention. They create the initial trauma or transformation, and then the phenomenon continues to interact with you through forms that are more personally invasive, through visitors who appear in your home, through dreams that feel more real than dreams should feel, through synchronicities that erode your confidence in consensus reality. The goal in this framework is not observation, it's transformation. The phenomenon is trying to change how you perceive reality, to open doors in your consciousness that you didn't know existed, to make you permeable to experiences that most humans never have access to. Why would it do this? We can only speculate. Perhaps it's conducting an experiment. Perhaps it's trying to communicate in the only way it knows how. Perhaps it's preparing certain individuals for something. Perhaps there is no goal at all, just interaction for its own sake. What we do know is that witnesses like Chris Bledsoe never fully return to normal. The experience marks them permanently. They become different people, more open to strange possibilities, more willing to question consensus reality, more aware that the world contains depths most people never perceive. In this interpretation, Ingrid Cold was not there to investigate or intimidate. He was there to continue the contact, to let Bledsoe know that what had begun by the Cape Fear River was not over, to ensure that he understood on some level that bypassed conscious thought that he had been chosen, marked, brought into a reality that most people never access. And if that's true, it worked. Because Bledsoe's life was never the same. The encounters continued, the strange events multiplied, and he became someone who lives between worlds, navigating both consensus reality and something stranger that exists alongside it. Whether Ingrid Cold was human, non-human, or something in between, his visit served its purpose. It ensured that Chris Bledsoe would never be able to forget what had happened on that cold January night. And it ensured that he would always be watching the sky, waiting for the lights to return, because they always do. Chapter 9. Psychological or non-human? This brings us to the core question, the one that every serious researcher must grapple with when examining cases like this, the question that has no easy answer but demands to be asked. What was Ingrid Cold? There are two dominant interpretations, two frameworks for understanding an encounter that resists simple explanation, and the truth, if we can ever access it, probably lies somewhere in the complex space between them. The first interpretation is psychological. The human mind is extraordinarily complex. It processes vast amounts of sensory data every second, filtering most of it out to create a coherent narrative of experience. Under normal circumstances, this works well. We perceive reality in ways that allow us to function, navigate, survive. But under conditions of extreme stress or trauma, these processes can break down. The mind can create false memories. It can distort real experiences. It can generate perceptions that feel absolutely real, but have no external referent. This is not a weakness, it's a feature. The mind is designed to find patterns, create coherence, generate meaning. When faced with something that doesn't fit existing frameworks, it adapts. It creates an explanation that makes sense within the person's understanding of how reality works. Chris Bledsoe experienced something profoundly traumatic by the Cape Fear River. Whether it was truly anomalous or had some conventional explanation, the psychological impact was real. The fear, the disorientation, the sense of encountering something beyond comprehension. In the days following such an experience, the mind is vulnerable, still processing, still trying to make sense of what happened. Defense mechanisms are active. The person is in a heightened state of alertness, scanning for threats, interpreting neutral stimuli as potentially dangerous. In this state, it's possible that Bledsoe did receive a visitor, perhaps a journalist who had somehow learned about the sighting, perhaps a local investigator, perhaps even a legitimate government employee who happened to be in the area and was curious about the report. And in Bledsoe's traumatized, hyper-alert state, his mind transformed that visitor into something strange. Memory distortion amplified by stress created the odd behaviours, the mechanical speech, the lack of credentials. His mind filled in gaps with elements drawn from cultural narratives about men in black, creating a coherent story that fit the trauma he had just experienced. The odd name could be a memory error. Perhaps the visitor gave a normal name that Bledsoe misheard or misremembered. The lack of credentials could be a detail his stressed mind simply overlooked. The strange behaviours could be normal behaviours interpreted through the lens of trauma as threatening and wrong. This is the rational explanation, the one that fits within consensus reality and psychological science, and it cannot be entirely dismissed. We know that memory is malleable, we know that trauma affects perception, we know that people under stress misinterpret neutral stimuli. There are decades of research supporting these facts, but here's the problem. This explanation doesn't account for everything. It doesn't explain how Ingrid Cole demonstrated knowledge of details Bledsoe had never shared publicly, details about the sighting that only Bledsoe and his immediate family knew. Unless there was surveillance, which Bledsoe's subsequent investigations found no evidence of, there's no conventional way for a stranger to possess that information. It doesn't explain why no person or agency ever claimed responsibility for the visit, why no one came forward when Bledsoe made inquiries, why his FOIA requests turned up nothing. If a real person conducted that interview, they should exist somewhere in some system, but they don't. It doesn't explain the predictions that came true, the specific statements Ingrid Cole made about future events in Bledsoe's life that materialized exactly as described. Unless we're willing to attribute all of that to coincidence, which strengthens credibility, it doesn't explain the patterns. The fact that dozens of other UFO witnesses have reported nearly identical encounters with visitors who display the same behaviours, ask the same types of questions, and vanish in the same inexplicable way. If each case was individual psychological distortion, the distortion shouldn't be so consistent across different people in different locations at different times. The psychological explanation accounts for some elements, but not all, and the elements it can't account for are precisely the ones that make this case significant. Which brings us to the second interpretation, non-human intelligence. If the UFO encounter itself was real, if what Chris Bledsoe witnessed that night was genuinely anomalous and not susceptible to conventional explanation, then we must consider the possibility that Ingrid Cole was part of that same phenomenon. Not a government investigator, not a misremembered journalist, but something else entirely. Something that understood it needed to present as human authority, but lacked the full capacity to execute that presentation convincingly. This would explain everything the psychological model struggles with. The impossible knowledge becomes explicable if Ingrid Cole was connected to whatever intelligence orchestrated the UFO encounter. If he was part of the same system, he would naturally know details about the event without need for surveillance or investigation. The lack of records becomes logical if Ingrid Cole never existed within human systems. If he was a construct, a temporary manifestation created for this specific interaction, then of course there would be no employment history, no documentation, no trace in official databases. The strange behaviours make sense if this was an attempt by non-human intelligence to mimic human authority figures. The formal speech patterns could reflect an understanding of how officials should speak based on outdated or incomplete information. The rigid posture could be a misunderstanding of human body language. The lack of blinking could be a simple oversight in the mimicry. The name itself could be a translation error or a designation that was never meant to be a convincing human name. Just a label that would suffice for this brief interaction. In this interpretation, Ingrid Cold was never human. He was something, wearing a human appearance the way we might wear a costume, close enough to pass casual inspection but revealing its artificiality upon closer examination. But this interpretation raises its own difficult questions. If Ingrid Cold was a non-human entity, what was he? An alien in a physical sense? Some kind of interdimensional being? A construct created through technology we don't understand? A manifestation of consciousness that doesn't require physical substrate? Why appear at all? If the goal was simply to monitor witnesses, there are less detectable methods. Why risk exposure through direct contact? Why the bureaucratic approach? Why mimic government authority specifically? What purpose does that serve? And most fundamentally, if non-human intelligence has the capacity to create convincing human forms, why create one that's not quite convincing? Why include elements that trigger the uncanny valley response? Why not make the disguise perfect, unless imperfection is intentional? Unless the strangeness serves a purpose? Unless the goal is not to be convincing but to be memorable? To create an experience that will stick in the witness's mind? To generate exactly the kind of confusion and questioning that makes the encounter significant. In psychological operations, there's a technique called defamiliarization. You take something familiar and make it slightly wrong. This triggers deeper processing. The mind can't simply categorize it as normal and move on. It has to engage. It has to question. It has to remember. If non-human intelligence understands human psychology, and there's considerable evidence it does, then sending a visitor who is almost human but not quite might be a deliberate strategy. It ensures the witness will remember, will question, will be transformed by the experience. But here's the deepest question, the one that both interpretations struggle with. Why does it matter which explanation is correct? Whether Ingrid Cold was a psychological manifestation or a non-human entity, the effect on Chris Bledsoe was the same. His reality was fundamentally altered. He experienced something that resisted conventional explanation. He was marked by an encounter that transformed his relationship with consensus reality. From Bledsoe's subjective perspective, the distinction between real and psychological becomes meaningless. The experience was real to him. It had real consequences. It changed his life in measurable ways. This is what researchers mean when they talk about experiential reality. What matters is not necessarily what objectively occurred, but what the witness experienced and how that experience affected them. Ingrid Cold existed. Maybe not in the way a normal human exists, maybe not in physical space the way we understand it, but he existed in Chris Bledsoe's experience, and that existence had consequences. The two interpretations, psychological and non-human, are not necessarily exclusive. Reality may be stranger and more complex than either framework alone can capture. Perhaps consciousness and external reality interact in ways that make the boundary between them more permeable than we usually assume. Perhaps high strangeness encounters occur in a space where psychology and objective reality blur together, where the mind's capacity to create experience intersects with genuine anomalous phenomena, where the question, did this really happen, becomes impossible to answer because it happened in a mode that doesn't fit our categories of real versus imaginary. The case of Ingrid Cold remains unresolved. We have one witness's testimony. We have patterns that connect this case to many others. We have an absence of documentation that is itself significant. But we have no definitive proof, no smoking gun that would confirm either interpretation beyond doubt, and perhaps that's exactly how it's meant to be. Because the uncertainty, the ambiguity, the impossibility of resolution, these are all part of the experience, part of what makes high strangeness cases transformative. They force us to sit with not knowing, to accept that reality might be more complex than our frameworks can capture, to recognise that our confident categories of real versus unreal, human versus non-human, psychological versus objective, might be insufficient for understanding what's actually happening. Ingrid Cold walked out of Chris Bledsoe's house and vanished. Where he went, we cannot say. Whether he ever truly existed in the first place, we cannot prove. But he left behind questions that refuse to be easily answered, and sometimes the questions themselves are the point. Chapter 10. Why the Story Persists. We're now several years past the original encounter. Chris Bledsoe's experience with Ingrid Cold has entered the permanent record of high strangeness cases. It's discussed in research forums, analysed in books, referenced by investigators working on similar cases. The question is, why? Why does this story persist when so many others fade into obscurity? The case of Ingrid Cold endures because it resists easy categorisation. It occupies a unique space in UFO research, not flashy enough for mainstream media attention, not obscure enough to be forgotten, sitting precisely in that zone where serious researchers find the most interesting data. Consider what this case is not. It is not sensational. There are no dramatic abductions, no surgical procedures performed by aliens, no apocalyptic warnings delivered by otherworldly beings. The encounter with Ingrid Cold was quiet, mundane almost, in its execution. A man knocked on a door, asked questions, left. That's the entire visible sequence of events. From an outside observer's perspective, nothing extraordinary occurred. This mundanity is precisely what makes it compelling, because the devil is in the details. The strangeness emerges not from what happened, but from how it happened, the small discrepancies, the subtle wrongness, the accumulation of minor anomalies that add up to something significant. There are no threats. Ingrid Cold never intimidated Bledsoe, never warned him to stay silent, never made veiled or explicit threats about consequences if he spoke publicly about his experience. The classic Men in Black narrative involves intimidation, but this case lacks that element. Instead, the intimidation, if we can call it that, was more subtle. It came from the encounter itself, from the wrongness of Ingrid Cold's presence, from the realization that someone who shouldn't exist had shown up and demonstrated knowledge they shouldn't possess. The psychological impact was profound, but it didn't come from threats. It came from destabilization, from having your reality undermined in small but significant ways. There are no dramatic confrontations, no chase scenes, no physical evidence left behind, no photographs or recordings, just one man's testimony about a 30-minute conversation that officially never happened. It's a quiet encounter, almost mundane in its execution. And yet, it lingers. It refuses to be dismissed or forgotten. It occupies mental space in researchers and witnesses who encounter the story. Why? Because it taps into something primal, something that operates below conscious reasoning. The fear of being watched, not by cameras or governments in the conventional sense, but by something that exists outside the normal frameworks of observation, something that sees you without your knowledge or consent, something that knows things about you it has no business knowing. The fear of authority without accountability. We live in systems built on accountability. Police officers have badge numbers. Federal agents have supervisors. Even the most powerful individuals operate within structures that theoretically provide oversight. But what if you encounter authority that has no oversight, that answers to no one, that can operate completely outside normal systems of accountability? That's a fundamentally different kind of power, and it's terrifying precisely because it's unconstrained. The fear that the people who claim to protect us might not be people at all. We build our societies on certain assumptions. One of those assumptions is that we can recognize other humans, that we know what human behavior looks like, that anyone who walks and talks like a person is a person. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if human appearance can be mimicked by something non-human? What if the familiar forms we encounter daily might occasionally be masks worn by something else entirely? That possibility undermines fundamental trust. It makes every interaction potentially suspect. It introduces paranoia into the most basic social exchanges. These fears are not rational in the conventional sense. They're evolutionary. They're wired deep in our psychology. And the Ingrid cold case activates all of them without providing any resolution or comfort. The case also persists because it's modern. This is not a story from the 1950s, buried in dusty files and fading memories. This happened in 2007, in the age of digital records and pervasive surveillance, in a time when anonymity should be nearly impossible to achieve. If this case had occurred in 1953, we could dismiss the lack of documentation as a product of that era. Records were less comprehensive, information systems were more fragmented. It was easier for things to slip through the cracks. But in 2007, in an era where almost everyone leaves digital footprints, where employment records are computerized, where background checks can surface information from decades past, where the internet makes anonymity increasingly difficult, the complete absence of any trace of Ingrid Cold in this context is far more significant. It suggests either a level of operational security that exceeds anything in the public knowledge base, or it suggests someone who never existed within human systems in the first place. And yet Ingrid Cold remains anonymous, despite the digital tools available, despite the searchable databases, despite the interconnected information systems that theoretically make everyone traceable. He exists only in Chris Bledsoe's testimony, only in the pattern of similar encounters reported by other witnesses, only in the negative space created by his absence from official records. There's also the matter of credibility. Chris Bledsoe never sought fame from this experience. He didn't immediately write a book. He didn't go on a media tour. He didn't start a podcast or a YouTube channel. He didn't attempt to monetize his encounter in any obvious way. He simply told his story, quietly and consistently, to researchers who were willing to listen without judgment, to investigators who approached the case with genuine curiosity rather than predetermined conclusions. That authenticity matters, because when someone fabricates a story, they tend to embellish. They add dramatic elements. They make themselves the hero. They create a narrative arc that builds to a satisfying conclusion. Bledsoe did none of that. His account is restrained, almost reluctant. He describes what happened without trying to convince anyone it happened. He presents the facts as he experienced them and leaves the interpretation to others. He admits to uncertainty where uncertainty exists. He acknowledges elements that might have conventional explanations. He doesn't claim to know things he doesn't know. This restraint is a hallmark of genuine experience. People who have truly encountered something anomalous often struggle to describe it. They use tentative language. They acknowledge gaps in their understanding. They resist the neat narratives that fictional accounts tend to produce. Bledsoe's testimony has that quality. It feels real precisely because it doesn't feel polished. It contains inconsistencies, not because he's lying, but because memory is imperfect and traumatic experiences are hard to articulate clearly. And that restraint is what makes it credible to serious researchers. They've encountered enough hoaxes and attention seekers to recognise the difference. The lack of embellishment is evidence of authenticity. The case also persists because it connects to something larger. It's not an isolated data point. It's part of a pattern that extends across decades and geographical boundaries. Other witnesses have reported similar encounters. The behaviours described, the impossible knowledge, the lack of credentials, the mechanical speech, the sudden appearances and disappearances, these patterns suggest a phenomenon, something systematic rather than random, something that repeats with enough consistency to indicate intelligence and purpose, and phenomena demand explanation. They resist being dismissed as one-off anomalies. They force serious engagement because they keep happening. The Ingrid Cold case has become a reference point. When new witnesses come forward with similar experiences, researchers compare notes. They look for common elements. They build databases of characteristics. And Ingrid Cold keeps appearing in those databases, not literally but as a pattern, as a type, as an example of how these encounters tend to unfold. That's why the story persists, not because it's sensational or dramatic, but because it's representative. It captures something essential about a type of experience that continues to occur. and as long as people keep reporting visits from strange men who claim authority without proving it, who know things they shouldn't know, and who vanish without trace, the case of Ingrid Cold will remain relevant. It's a template, a framework for understanding encounters that resist conventional explanation. A reminder that sometimes the most disturbing events are not the ones that make headlines, but the quiet ones that happen behind closed doors and leave no evidence except in the transformed consciousness of the witness. Epilogue: The Agent Without a File. So who was Ingrid Cold? After all this examination, all this analysis, all this careful consideration of evidence and interpretation, we return to the question that started this journey, and we find that we still don't have a definitive answer. We may never know. If he was human, there should be records. Every human who works for a government agency, every person who conducts official business leaves traces: employment history, tax records, a social security number, a driver's license, background checks, security clearances, something. In the modern bureaucratic state, it's almost impossible to function officially without generating documentation. The entire system is built on paper trails and digital footprints. You cannot move through official channels without leaving evidence of your movement. But there's nothing. No employment records, no tax documentation, no security clearances, no badge numbers, no supervisors who remember assigning someone to investigate a UFO sighting in rural North Carolina. No databases that contain any reference to the name Ingrid Cold in connection with official government work. The search has been exhaustive. Researchers have pursued every lead. FOIA requests have covered every conceivable agency. Private investigators have run background checks. The usual tools for verifying someone's existence and identity have all been deployed, and every single one has come back negative. If he was not human, if he was something else entirely, then the absence of records makes perfect sense. Because how do you document something that was never real in the conventional sense? How do you create an employment file for a temporary manifestation? How do you issue a social security number to a construct that exists only long enough to conduct one interview? How do you generate background checks for an entity that has no background? The absence of records could be evidence not of secretive efficiency, but of fundamental non-existence within human systems. The most convincing disguises, after all, are the ones that don't need to be explained. They simply exist briefly in the space between perception and reality. A perfect disguise would leave no trail because there would be nothing to trace. It would be smoke, appearing solid enough to be seen, but dissolving the moment you try to grasp it. Ingrid Cold appeared. He manifested at Chris Bledsoe's door with enough substance to be perceived, engaged with, remembered. He asked his questions with enough presence to create the impression of authority and purpose. He demonstrated knowledge he should not have had, suggesting either impossible surveillance or impossible connection to the phenomenon itself. And then he left, dissolving back into whatever void he had emerged from, not leaving, through normal means, not getting into a car and driving away, just ceasing to be present, transitioning from existence to non-existence in the space between the door and the driveway. Chris Bledsoe is still alive, still living in North Carolina, still experiencing intermittent contact with whatever phenomenon marked him that January night in 2007. He has had additional sightings, additional encounters. The strangeness has not stopped. If anything, it has deepened, become more integrated into his life. He has learned to live with it, to navigate both ordinary reality and the stranger reality that exists alongside it. He still tells his story when asked, but he no longer expects answers. He has accepted that some questions cannot be answered within our current frameworks of understanding, that some experiences exist beyond the reach of conventional explanation. He knows what he experienced. He was there. He sat across from Ingrid Cold. He heard that mechanical voice. He felt that uncanny presence. The encounter was real in every way that matters, whether others believe it, whether it can be proven, whether it fits within consensus reality. These have become secondary concerns. The encounter happened. It changed him. It opened doors in his consciousness that most people never access. It made him aware that the world contains depths and complexities that resist our neat categories and comfortable explanations, and he is not alone. Other witnesses continue to come forward. Other people report visits from strange figures who claim authority without proving it, who know things they shouldn't know, who appear and disappear in ways that defy conventional explanation. The pattern continues, the phenomenon persists. Whatever intelligence operates behind these encounters shows no sign of stopping. Because some encounters are not meant to be understood in conventional terms. They are meant to transform, to destabilize, to remind us that the world is stranger than we allow ourselves to believe, that there are doors we don't see until they open, visitors we cannot track until they appear, questions we're not equipped to answer with our current models of reality. Ingrid Cold walked through one of those doors, or perhaps he was the door itself, a threshold between ordinary reality and something else, something that most people never access but that some, through accident or design, encounter directly, and somewhere, in some record system we cannot access, his visit may still be logged, not in FBI databases or CIA files or Department of Defense archives, but in whatever system actually tracks these encounters, whatever intelligence actually monitors contact between human witnesses and phenomena that refuse to be categorized. That record exists somewhere, in some framework we haven't discovered, in some archive beyond our current ability to access, not under his name, because Ingrid Cold was never his name, it was never meant to be a real name. It was simply what he called himself, a designation that served its purpose for exactly 30 minutes, long enough to ask the questions, to demonstrate the impossible knowledge, to create the destabilization, and then to dissolve back into whatever matrix of reality generates such manifestations, leaving behind only a witness who will never forget, a story that will never be fully explained, and questions that will persist as long as people continue to look at the sky and wonder what else might be looking back. Closing thoughts. The Ingrid Cold case sits at the intersection of UFO research, men in black law, and modern high strangeness phenomena. It is a case without resolution, without proof, without closure. And perhaps that's the point, because the most effective way to control information is not to suppress it entirely. That creates martyrs, that generates suspicion, that makes the information more compelling through its very prohibition. No, the most effective way to control information is to make it unverifiable, to ensure that even when someone tells the truth, no one can prove it, to create a zone of ambiguity where the signal is real but permanently mixed with noise, to make truth and fiction indistinguishable, to ensure that anyone sharing the information can be dismissed as mistaken, delusional, or attention-seeking. This is more effective than censorship, because it allows the information to exist while stripping it of credibility. It creates a kind of containment through confusion. The truth is spoken, but it cannot spread effectively because it cannot be verified. If that's the strategy behind visits like Ingrid Cold's, it's remarkably successful. Because Bledsoe's story exists, it's available, anyone can hear it, but it exists in that zone where proof is impossible and doubt is always available. Ingrid Cold may have been a psychological manifestation, a distorted memory, a misidentified visitor whose normal characteristics were transformed by trauma into something strange. Or he may have been exactly what he appeared to be, an agent without a file, a representative of something we do not understand, a reminder that we are being watched by forces we cannot see, much less verify or control. The case remains open. Not officially, because there was never an official investigation. There were never official records. There is no official file to close. But in the minds of those who study the unexplained, in the collections of researchers who document high strangeness encounters, in the consciousness of witnesses like Chris Bledsoe, who have crossed thresholds most people never approach, Ingrid Cold is still out there, still asking questions, still collecting data, still appearing at the homes of witnesses who have seen something they were perhaps not meant to see, and still leaving no trace, still generating no documentation, still existing in that impossible space between consensus, reality, and something stranger. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. Thank you for staying with this story through all its complexities and ambiguities. Thank you for being willing to sit with questions that have no easy answers. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the strangest cases in modern UFO research, please consider supporting the channel. Use your hype points if you're watching on YouTube. It genuinely helps more than you know and allows us to keep creating these detailed investigations into the unexplained. Leave a review if you're on Spotify. Reviews help other listeners find us and let us know what kinds of stories resonate with you. And let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. We love hearing from you. We love knowing that these stories are reaching people in different time zones, different countries, different contexts. There's something beautiful about a global community united by curiosity about the strange and unexplained. Until next time, sleep well. Or try to, at least. And remember, not everyone who knocks on your door is who they claim to be. Not everyone who claims authority can prove it. Not everyone who knows things they shouldn't know has a conventional explanation for that knowledge. The world is stranger than we usually admit, full of doors we don't see, visitors we cannot track, encounters that transform us in ways we never fully understand. Chris Bledsoe opened one of those doors, or perhaps it was open for him. Perhaps it was never a door at all, but a threshold that dissolved the moment he crossed it, leaving him changed and unable to return to the innocent assumptions he once held about how reality works. That's what high strangeness does. It marks you, changes you, makes it impossible to see the world the same way again. And somewhere out there, Ingrid Cold continues his work.